Hello friend, welcome back to my channel. How are you today? I hope you're doing well. It's Tim here, and in this video I'll be guiding you through the steps to create this happy little landscape. So I've been working on a couple more tutorials in the style coming up, so I'm super excited to finally be able to share this with you. This painting is kind of a hybrid made up of different elements of a Bob Ross painting mixed with a little of my own flair and style thrown in. And I think this would be a great painting for digital painters just beginning their journey or experienced painters who just want to try something different. So please join me on this painting adventure today. If you should recreate this painting and are on Instagram, please tag me at Timstar Studio. I would absolutely love to see it. So upcoming here are the brushes that you're going to need to be able to paint this painting with me, and all of these can be found in the default library. And if you need the damp brush, I do have a video up on my channel on how to recreate a version of it for the iPad, so definitely go check that out. Here are the hex codes for the color palette and then the palette setup that you're going to use. And then the first step of this art tutorial will be for you to trace this outline layer into a blank layer and then copy over it so you can follow along. And then when you're ready, let's begin. Alright, so to get into the tutorial, so the first thing we're going to do is to paint our background. So using the soft airbrush and the first color in the first row, we're going to lay down a stripe of pink down the center of the painting, and then we're going to repeat the same step with the second and the third color in the first row, placing each color as a stripe on top of the next. And then using Gaussian blur, we're going to blur it to about 42%. I'm then going to create a copy of this layer, and I'm going to flip it vertically and place it underneath, filling up the rest of the canvas with the colors, mirroring the top but upside down, and don't worry about getting it 100% perfect, just as long as it's close. So I'm going to take the trace layer and I'm going to turn it down to about 8 to 9% or so. Then I'm going to create a new layer. Then I'm going to take the white that is the second color in the first row, and I'm going to switch over to the damp brush, and we're going to start painting our clouds. So with a small to medium sized brush with high opacity, I'm going to start laying down some color over top of the cloud outline. And the reason I turned the outline down just a little bit was just to see our area where we're painting. Sometimes when you have a black line over it, it makes it kind of hard to see it. So I'm just repeating this same process over the rest of the cloud outlines. So next I'm going to switch over to the blending tool with the damp brush, and with a small to medium size with very low opacity, we're going to lightly blend out our clouds. And I'm leaving kind of the tops of them alone just so that they retain their shape a little bit, but we really want to blend them out and kind of make them one with our background. Next, we're going to make another layer of clouds, so we're going to add a new layer, and then using the same color, we're going to make the brush just a little bit smaller, and I'm going to kind of concentrate a little bit more color just on the tops of these newly formed clouds, just adding a little bit of definition to the tops and the middles. And then like before, we're going to switch over to the blending brush, only we're going to use a slightly bigger size brush this time, still with really low opacity, and we're going to lightly buff out these clouds. And when you're happy with the way your clouds look, next we're going to paint our mountains. So we're going to add a new layer, and then using the third color in the fourth row, so the darkest blue, we're going to switch over to the water pen, and we're going to start outlining our mountains. And then we're going to use a medium-sized brush, and we're going to lightly fill in those mountains. If a little bit of the background shows through too here, don't worry about it, we'll fill it in here in just a moment. And here is where I'm going to make a copy of this layer, so now there's two, and I'm going to merge them down so now they're one, and now the mountain layer is a little bit thicker and the background doesn't show through. Now on this mountain layer, I'm going to switch over to the blending tool and the soft airbrush, and with about 20% opacity and medium-sized brush, we're going to lightly blend out the bottom and the edges, kind of blurring some of that mountain color down to about where the trees are going to be. Alright, so when you're happy with your blending and when it's all smoothed out, we're going to switch over to the burnt tree brush so we can start painting our snow. Alright, so we're going to start by using a smaller size brush, and the light source is coming from the right hand side, so we're going to start by painting the highlights on the peaks of the right side of the mountain. And you'll kind of want to do a smaller size area to begin with, but feel free to add as little or as much as you'd like. Then we're going to switch the brush over to just a slightly larger size, and I'm going to drag the highlight down the center of the mountain and into the bottom of the right-hand side only. And in these areas to create them, I'm trying not to make the color too dense so they're not too bright, so I'm keeping a very light pressure, allowing just a little bit of that color from underneath to still show through. Then I'm going to take this layer opacity and turn it down to about 65%. So adding a new layer, still using the same color, I'm going to repeat the process, brightening up these highlights just a little bit. And with turning down the other layer of highlights, it'll really make this layer of highlights really pop. And when you're adding shadow on the mountain, you're going to want to make sure it's not too like straight up and down. That'll create a more pyramid-like shape. You'll want to create like sharp and jagged points, things that aren't too symmetrical. Asymmetry is perfect for mountains. Next, we're going to start painting the shadows. So I'm going to add a new layer, and then using the 5th color in the 4th row, we're going to start doing the same thing, only in the opposite direction. Just lightly filling in those shadowed areas. And you'll want to make sure too to not like completely erase all of the dark. It's okay to leave just a little bit of darkness around the edges. So just going right up to the point and then pulling back. Then I'm going to turn this layer opacity down to about 75% or so, which will really help create a nice shadow. So I'm going to add a new layer and then basically repeating that, just kind of brightening the edges up right where the peaks are and where the sun is going to be kind of hitting the sides of the mountain, but we don't want to take it over because we don't want the entire shadowed area that bright. Happy with your shadows? In a new layer, I'm going to take the soft airbrush and the 2nd color in the 1st row, switching back over to that light yellowish white color, and I'm going to paint a stripe of color right around the bottom of the mountain to create kind of a fog effect. And then using Gaussian blur, we're going to blur it to about 37% or so. Which brings us to our first mini painting break, friend. So if you need to stop and relax and reset for a minute, I'll be here waiting for you to begin part 2. All right, so getting back into it. So switching back over to the water pen, we're going to start painting our trees. So using the 1st color in the 2nd row, I'm going to start creating up and down flicking motions to start creating our background trees. With this, you'll want to use a pretty small brush size with high opacity. That way you have better control of it. And every once in a while, I'm creating a little flick that's higher than the rest of it, just kind of creating taller trees. And then when you're happy with it, I'm going to make a copy of it to make it a little bit darker and turn that layer opacity down to about 66%. And then I'm going to switch over to the blending tool, only we're going to use the water pen instead with it. And then we're going to take a medium to small size with medium opacity, and we're going to lightly blend out the tops of the trees using the same motions. And by softening these edges up, it'll create a slight transparency between the trees and the background, and it'll make it look like the trees are even further back than they are. And then we're going to add a new layer, and then using the water pen again, we're going to create some darker trees right in the front, kind of flicking up into those more recessed areas that we just created. And then we're going to repeat the same process with the blending tool, just kind of flicking up and over those background trees, but even more sparingly than before. When you're happy with your trees, we're going to add a new layer and switch to the damp brush. Using the 2nd color in the 2nd row, we're going to start painting our bushes. And you can start this by painting little M shapes, by creating the 2 little hills and then filling them in. And then we're going to fill in just a little bit of color beneath them just to make them solid, just to create the edge of our grass line. When you're happy with your bushes, we're going to add a new layer, and I'm actually going to put this layer underneath of the bushes. We're going to grab the 3rd color in the 2nd row, and I'm going to create a layer of grass underneath. And you want to make it kind of thin, but just enough to create a little bit of a bank. I'm going to merge those 2 layers together, and then using that same green, we're going to start creating the hills of our bushes. And you can add as many or as little as you'd like. I'm creating a decent amount of them, and then we're going to take the blending tool, and you're going to want to switch the blender back to the damp brush, and we're going to lightly blend those all out. You kind of want to fluff these out the same way we do clouds, only where we're actually preserving some of the dark color underneath, and then kind of fluffing that out and blending it into the light green on top. When you're happy with the amount of bushes that you have, we're going to lightly kind of blend the bottoms of them into the grass area and then kind of continue it off onto that left corner because I kind of forgot to fill that in, so we're going to fill that in quickly. All right, so we're going to make a copy of this layer, and then I'm going to turn this layer opacity down to about 61% or so. I just want to make it a little bit more dense. Then I'm going to merge these layers back down into one. Then I'm going to add a new layer and put it into overlay. I'm going to use this new color I just added to the palette. That's the second color in the fourth row. With a small size brush and medium to high opacity, we're going to start laying some highlight color over the grass and the bushes. But we're really only going to focus the highlight color on the bushes that are closest to the grass and to the ground. Next, we're going to start painting our trees. So using the water pen now and the first color in the second row in a new layer, I'm going to paint a straight line. And then using a small brush size, I'm going to paint from right to left with small flicking motions, flicking out little branches that are kind of spaced a little bit away from each other that kind of vary in size, and then varying it down as they go down the line. And then about halfway down, I'm going to increase the brush size. That way the branches can start getting a little bit further separated and a little bit bigger the farther down they go. And currently, as I am making this video, I do have a video coming out very soon about how to create detailed pine trees, so I'm super excited for that. And then we're going to flip the canvas, and I'm going to repeat the same process on the other side. For some reason, I just find it easier to paint from right to left, so that's why I flip it, and it also helps keep the tree a little bit more symmetrical looking. When you're happy with your tree shape, I'm going to add a new layer, and using the water pen again in the second color in the second row, we're going to lay down a very sparse layer of color over top of our pine tree. Really allowing just a little bit of that darker green to still show through. This is just going to kind of act like a mini highlight on top of the tree. Making sure that the top of it's still a little bit thinner and a little bit more sparse. So when you're happy with your tree, we're going to merge those two layers together. I'm then going to flip my canvas back around just so it's the right direction. And then I'm going to make a copy of this tree layer. So now that there's two, I've got a reference and one to use. I'm going to place this tree about right there on the outline. I'm then going to make a copy of this tree. Using the layer that's on the bottom, I'm going to move it back just a little bit and make it thinner with the freeform tool. Open hue and saturation, and for this back tree, I'm going to turn the saturation to about 38% and the brightness down to about 48%. And then this front tree, I'm going to turn the saturation up to about 61% and the brightness up to 51%, just so that way there's a little bit more difference between the back tree and the front tree is just a little bit brighter. I'm then going to hide the reference layer just so it's not in our way. I'm going to color drop this front tree and merge them onto the same layer, and we're going to use the water pen again, and I'm going to correct any branches that might need to be made just a little bit thicker so that way they show up better. We're going to add another layer, and then I'm going to open our layers tool, and I'm going to place this layer over top of the bushes. That way it's over top of everything. And then still using the water pen in the first color in the second row, I'm only going to fill in 3 of the bushes with this color and only make 3 of them dark. I'm then going to add the second color in the second row, and I'm going to fill in the rest of the bushes. Then I'm going to take the eraser tool with the soft airbrush, and we're going to erase the area that's going to become a rock later on. I'm then going to switch back over to the blending tool, and we're going to lightly blend out all of the edges, kind of puffing them up like what we did with the ones in the background. And this is where I'm going in and really blending out and buffing out those areas that the transparency might be showing through from the background just to make sure it's solid. We're allowing just a little bit of the transparency around the edges. I just don't want it in like the center of the bushes. And this layer will really help to hide the pine tree layer on the top and the background layer just so it kind of all matches together. Then when you're happy with your blending, I'm going to add a new layer, and we're going to start painting the tops of the bushes, only we're going to save our hands a little bit of work. So this is going to be a really cool section. So then switching back over to the damp brush, then using the third color in the second row, I'm going to have you pick whichever bush you'd like, and then with small circular motions, I'm going to have us color just the tops of it. And then using the blending brush again with the damp brush, we're going to lightly buff it out, leaving just a little bit of that hard edge on the top. And then when you're happy with your blending, I'm going to make a copy of this layer. So there's going to be two. Then I'm going to take this layer and we're going to put it in the bottom left corner. So now we've got a new bush with no work. I'm going to take the blending brush and we're going to lightly buff out those edges just so it's a little bit different. And then I'm going to repeat this process across all of the other bushes. I think it might be kind of cool too to go in and play with hue and saturation just a little bit. So feel free to have fun with it. I would recommend, if you change some of the tones a little bit like I am, to go in and make a duplicate of each. That way there's at least one or two more bushes of the same tone in it. That way it kind of marries all of the colors together throughout the painting. Let's go ahead and merge all of these bush layers back onto one. That way they're easier to deal with. This bush right here is kind of an odd shape, so I'm going to hand paint that one back in, and I'm going to use one of the brighter greens because it's later on it's going to have sun hitting it, so I'm okay if it's just a little bit brighter. And then when you're happy with it, I'm then going to make a copy of this layer so it's a bit darker. I'm then going to turn the opacity of this copy layer down to about 65%. Then when you're happy with your blending, I'm going to merge the dark layer and all of our bush layers back onto one. That way I can manipulate them a little bit easier. Then I'm going to go back in with our blending tool with the damp brush, and we're going to lightly even further puff out the edges of those, kind of giving the impression that there are leaves on each of them. That way they're not just like green clouds and they're actually read as bushes. And when we're blending this out, I'm going to allow just a little bit more of that transparency from the background to show through around the edges. And I'm going to kind of let certain areas crisscross over other bushes. That way it all kind of looks like it's growing into each other and doesn't look so like clean cut. It looks a little bit more like nature and a little bit more rough. And that brings us to our second painting break, friend. I'm going to go grab a coffee real quick and be right back. You have come so far, and I'm so proud of you for trying something different or out of your comfort zone. It's how we grow as artists. We've got a little bit ways left to go, but we're almost there. If you should recreate this painting, I would absolutely love to see it, so please tag me at Tim Star Studio, and I'll be here waiting when you're ready to begin again. Alright, so after you have everything blended out the way you want, we're going to add a new layer, and I'm going to put this layer into overlay. Still using the damp brush and the second green in the fourth row, we're going to lay down a bunch of dots over top of one of the bushes. And then we're going to lightly blend them out with the blending tool and still with the damp brush. I'm going to make a copy of this layer and place it over top of another bush just like we did from earlier. I'm going to add a couple more detail dots, blend it out, and then we're going to repeat the same process over the rest of the bushes. And then once you have all of your bush texture created, we're going to merge all of these overlay layers back onto the same bush layer. And you might have this happen where one of the overlapped areas might be a little bit lighter. So if this should happen to you, feel free to erase it and then just lightly buff it back out. Just in case it should happen, you'll know what to do with it. Alright, so next we're going to add some smaller detail leaves to each of the bushes. So we're going to use the eyedropper tool, and I'm going to color grab some of the lightest colors on our bushes. And I'm going to lay small dots over top of each of the top, the middle, and lightly on the bottom of each of the bushes. And then we're going to use the damp brush with the blending tool, and we're going to lightly blend each of them out, allowing just a little bit of the texture to still show through. And then I'm going to repeat this process all over all of the other bushes, lightly blending each one of them out. After you get this step done and you're happy with your blending, I'm going to add a new layer and put it underneath of the bushes. And then using the water pen and the fourth color in the first row, we're going to paint our rocks. Then on this same layer, switching back over to the damp brush, we're going to switch to the fifth color in the first row, and we're going to lay down a little bit of highlight color on our rocks. Alright, so now it's time to paint our water. So we're going to add a new layer, and then we're going to stick this layer underneath of all of the land layers, all of the bushes layers, so that way it's underneath of all of them. Then we're going to put this layer into overlay, and then using the third color in the fourth row, we're going to lay down some color over top of the water, and we're going to fill in most of the water, but we're going to leave just a little bit of a lighter ring just around the edges. Then I'm going to add another new layer and put that layer into overlay as well. And using the same color, we're going to add a little bit more shadow to the water. And I'm going to leave just a little bit of lighter color in the center of the water. And then we're going to take the damp brush with the blending tool, and we're going to lightly blend over these areas. And sometimes blending will take things away, so if you need to add more color, definitely feel free to. So it was here I decided I wanted to add another pine tree, so I'm sorry to backtrack a little bit. So I'm so glad I put everything on separate layers because I'm going to make a copy of our original tree layer, and then I'm going to make it a little bit thinner and place it right here next to our other trees. And I'm going to put it down just a little bit more just to cover the edges of the land and the bushes. And then I'm going to turn the brightness and saturation down one to about 49%. So now I'm going to make a copy canvas layer of this and paste it over the top, so now we have a fresh canvas to work on. Now I'm going to add a new layer, and we're going to put that layer into soft light, and we're going to start adding some shadows. I'm going to put a little bit of shadow on the edge of the water, and then I'm going to put it at the base of each of the bushes, and I'm going to kind of create some cross-hatching-esque shadows on the base of the bushes as well. That'll create some really nice texture later on. I'm going to put some shadow on the bushes and the grass in the background, and then I'm going to switch over to the blending tool, and we're going to lightly blend out those areas. And the shadow areas on the bushes don't need to be completely blended away smooth. A little bit of texture and roughness is definitely okay with this part. And for the back areas, I'm just lightly blending away any of the harder edges. The background shadows definitely don't need as much detail texture as the front does. And then I'm going to turn this layer opacity down to about 70%. Alright, so next we're going to add another new layer, and we're going to put that layer into soft light as well. And then using the damp brush, we're going to start laying some darker color around the left and bottom edge. And then we're going to move it onto the right edge as well. And then we're going to take the blending tool and start lightly blending it out. And this will help to create a really pretty vignette for our painting. I am also adding just a smidge of color to the very center of the painting too, just to deepen it a little bit, but I'm blending it out just the same way. When you're happy with your blending, I'm going to create another copy canvas. We're going to add a new layer, and switching over to the water pen and the second color in the first row, we're going to start sketching in our water line, and you'll want to use a really small brush with medium opacity. When you're happy with the water line, I'm going to switch back over to the damp brush, and in another new layer, I'm going to color drop our lightest color on each of our bushes just like before, and I'm going to add small detail leaves over top of the dark shadows that we just created. Adding these extra detail highlights will really make these areas pop, and then I'm going to take the blending tool with the damp brush again, very lightly with a small brush. We're going to lightly blend them out, still allowing a little bit of the texture to show through. And then we're going to repeat the same process over the background bushes, just color dropping the lightest color and adding highlight texture details over top of the shadowed areas and then around the edges just to make them look a little bit more wild. And then taking the blending tool with the damp brush again and lightly blending them out. Alright, so now it's time to move on to our finishing details. I'm going to add a new layer and put it into overlay. Then using the second color in the first row with the damp brush, we're going to lay a little bit of highlight color over the tops of the grass and the tops of the bushes, but very sparingly though, and we're going to put a little bit on the bushes in the front as well. And for this part, you'll probably want to use a smaller to medium-sized brush. And then we're going to take the blending brush and lightly blend it out. I'm then going to take another copy canvas and put that over the top of it. And then I'm going to add a new layer, and we're going to color drop some more detail highlights over top of the bushes. I'm basically just repeating the same process as before, using a small brush with a light hand and laying down even more details into these areas, just kind of filling up any spots that might be too dark or maybe a little flat. And then I'm going to switch over to the blending tool and lightly blend them out. And here, before we move on to the front highlights, I'm going to quickly add a new layer, and we're going to switch over to the water pen and still using your favorite shade of green, and you can feel free to color drop any shade of green that you'd like from your palette. And with a small sized brush and high opacity, we're going to create some detailed grass leaves that are poking up around the corners and the edges of the bushes. And we're going to put a couple of clusters of grass here in the background as well to kind of tie the two textures together. And then on this same layer, we're going to add some highlights to the tree trunks. So using the 5th color in the first row and still using the water pen, we're going to highlight our tree trunks from before. And you'll want to paint a really thin, straight line in either sets of 2 or 3. Now we're going to add some light rays. So let's add a new layer and put this layer into overlay. We're going to switch to the light pen from the luminance section, and then using the 2nd color in the 4th row, so that light green, we're going to paint 4 medium-sized light rays from the upper right-hand side to the lower left. And then using Gaussian blur, I'm going to blur it to about 19%. I'm going to turn the layer opacity down to about 43%, and then I'm going to create a copy of it. And then on the bottom of the 2 new layers, I'm going to use Gaussian blur again and blur it to about 30%. And then I'm going to add another new layer and put that layer into overlay again. And using the same shade of green as the light rays, we're going to switch over to the damp brush. And I'm going to paint some small dots over top of the areas where the light rays will have crossed over the bushes. And this will create some really pretty detail highlights over our bushes. And then using the blending tool again, we're going to lightly blend all of them out with very low opacity. And the last thing I want to do is use the hue and saturation tool and brighten the highlights up to about 56% just to make them pop a little bit more, and we're done. I'm going to use the light pen with a small size and this beautiful shade of red that's the very last color in our palette to sign my work with. And I wanted to thank you so much, friend, for watching and supporting my channel, and I hope you had fun painting along. If you recreate this painting, please tag me at Timstar Studio on Instagram. And if you enjoy this kind of content and want to see more videos like this, I actually have a couple of other tutorials up on my channel that you might enjoy. So I invite you to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video, friend. Happy painting!